Hi everyone, if you've ever played chess, you're probably familiar with most of Magnus Carlsen's games, but you might also have heard of the famous game between 13-year-old Magnus and Gary Kasparov. For those who don't know this game, I suggest you watch this video. Let's begin. This game begins with the moves d4, d5, c4, c6. Magnus is white, and Kasparov is black. He immediately refuses to take the pawn on c4 with the pawn on d5. Magnus immediately decided to undermine black's center, but Kasparov didn't go for it, because at the time, he was the first world chess champion, and Magnus was ranked 700th. We'll figure out what moves were in the game later, but now we'll look at the game without explanations. Magnus moves his pawn to d4. Kasparov responds symmetrically. Magnus undermines the black center, but his opponent is not an easy one and defends his pawn with the move c6. But Magnus strengthens the pawn on d4 with his knight.
Kasparov follows Magnus' lead.
Magnus attacks the black pawn with his second knight, and Kasparov defends it with e6. Magnus pins his knight to the queen with his bishop. Black defends his knight, and Magnus secures the pawn in the center.
Kasparov activates the queen and pins the knight. White gets a raid off the pin.
Black's bishop puts pressure on the previous pin. Defends two knights with his queen.
Black castles.
White decides to do the same and brings out his bishop. Kasparov notices that the white king is still in the center and attacks it with his pawn. White castles, and Kasparov attacks white's pawn, but Magnus moves his knight and attacks black's queen so that after black captures the pawn on c4, the bishop doesn't get stuck. The queen retreats, and white easily takes the pawn. Kasparov takes white's second pawn, and Magnus already takes it with his bishop. Black's position is quite bad, since his pieces aren't fully developed. White's is more pleasant, but black advances his pawn to a5. White blocks it with his pawn. Black retreats with his queen. Magnus decides to bring his rook to. Kasparov criticizes the white bishop in the center. Kasparov closes his queen by giving up his bishop in order to then give a discovered check by taking Magnus' knight in the event that white takes the bishop. Magnus doesn't care and takes the bishop when Kasparov gives a discovered check by taking the knight. Magnus simply closes with his bishop. Kasparov again closes his queen with his knight, making a deadly pin on the queen, but Magnus attacks the knight with his queen. Kasparov defends his knight with his rook. Magnus attacks the black pawn with his pawn. Kasparov moves the queen away from the pin, but Magnus, despite this, places his knight on d5. Black's knight is no longer held and it attacks the white knight, and Magnus takes the pawn on b6, attacking the queen. Kasparov takes in response, but the white knight takes Kasparov's pawn and attacks the rook. The rook moves away. Magnus continues to attack and attacks the black queen. The queen moves to the same file as his rook. Magnus brings out another rook, but Kasparov doesn't panic and attacks the knight.
The knight moves away. Black captures the knight.
White responds by doing the same. Kasparov wants to make checkmate. Magnus doesn't miss this and suggests exchanging queens. Kasparov agrees. He commits to a pawn on a file, and white defends. Black attacks white's bishop. The bishop moves away, defends. Black attacks white's bishop. The bishop moves away, and Kasparov exchanges rooks.
Kasparov
attacks white's unprotected pawn, but Magnus moves his rook toward it. Kasparov and Magnus move their kings to the center.
Kasparov wants to capture white's pawn.
Magnus is unable to defend it and exchanges it. Kasparov notices that white is going to push the outer pawn to queens and places his bishop so that on the next move he can block the pawn's path. In the game, white creates a bridge of pawns, and Kasparov pushes his king closer to white's pawns. Magnus follows suit and pushes his king. Black can afford to split white's pawns. And after capturing white's rook on
C1 checks black's king.
Activated on the second rank. The king guards 2 pawns at once, and the rook attacks white's passed pawn. The bishop defends it, and black stands still and asks white what they will do. White moves his rook to c1, preparing to check black's king. Kasparov places his pawn on g5, and after check, retreats. White wants to win 1 pawn in 3 moves, but Kasparov attacks the pawn with his bishop and rook, and it can be defended by sacrificing the passed pawn, blocking the rook's action. This game ended in a draw. Thanks to everyone who watched this video to the end. See you soon. Bye everyone.